It's great to see everyone here. Yeah, I guess everyone's pretty far up. As long as you can see the slides. Can you hear me okay back there?
Yes.
All right, no PA system. That's community theater stage training there. So I've been a forester in the state lands program for almost 28 years. And just last month, I left state forest work to work in the private and municipal lands program. So I'm a newcomer there. I am now the service forester for Central Connecticut, which includes even where we are here in Hampton. So that said, most of my experience is working on public land for the state in State Forest of Northwest Connecticut. So today, stewardship and a canopy of change. Change is really something that we're all going through in multiple ways, and this is a great lead-in for next year's topic. Oh, let's see. Oh, there we go. I'm learning. There's only 3 buttons on it. I can't go too wrong. So today we want to talk a little bit about history, because history and forests are very intertwined in our state. There's very much a connection there. We're going to talk about the forest of today and where we are with our forest cover in Connecticut. We're going to talk about climate change a little bit and give you some introduction to some principles that we're probably going to go a lot more into in the next year and how it relates to forestry.
You're welcome.
What is stewardship? What is management? Why are we managing forest? We're going to talk about resilience and what is an actual forester, as a little bit of background on the profession as a career choice that you can go talk to your students about. So, forest in history. We all probably know that there's a strong agricultural history in Connecticut. Most of our property, most of our lands here in the state were cleared for agriculture at one point. And then the forest regrew. And they actually started to regrow as early as the 1830s and 1840s, when we first started seeing initial abandonment of agricultural land. But most of the history we're going to focus on today is the beginning of the 20th century onward, because that's what has most impacted and shaped the forest that we all know here in the state today. So at the beginning of the 20th century was quite a tumultuous time. We had large, destructive forest fires. Just between 1910 and 1912, we had 127,000 acres of fires. This peaked around 1910, 1912. Around 1915 it peaked. I don't know if anyone here today can picture tens of thousands of acres of fires in one year, but that was pretty much the norm back then through World War I. We lost American chestnut to chestnut blight just within a few years. This was a major forest tree and cover type, and we lost that from this disease. And most of the original forests that were cleared for agriculture and returned were being clear cut again around this time for charcoal production. The picture on the right is a charcoal mound, where you would cut smaller, what we call pole-sized trees, stack them up about 30 cords in sort of a teepee fashion, have a chimney left in the middle, and then you would cover it with dirt and duff and slow burn it from the inside to produce charcoal. Now, before we had coal and oil, this charcoal was a huge driver for our industry. So, what did we have? We had fire, we had clear cutting and fire. We had loss of chestnut. All these things were going on. These were massive, major disturbances. And what did it do? It established our primary forest cover type in the state, oak hickory. Oak is very disturbance dependent and shade intolerant, and it thrived. It came back on a lot of this property. So today, most of our forests, except for maybe in the northwest corner and the southeast, closer to the ocean, are pretty much oak hickories. This was a forest fire in 1905 in East Hartford, the aftermath. Now, 1901. I'm not going to get into any of these details, except what you want to know from this is that this was a turning point in our state. The Act concerning reforestation of barren lands was the beginning. This is when we hired a state forester for the first time in our state. And 2 years later, we established the state forest system. And it was in 1903 we established Mashawmasick State Forest in the Portland area. And now we have 33 different state forests totaling about 175,000 acres. So today, human impact on forests. Now, everyone can probably recognize from the picture on the left, this is kind of a typical hardwood woodland that you might see, stone walls running through the woods, pretty indicative of our agricultural past. And if you look on the right, you'll notice that there's an interesting relationship between human population and forest land. It shows the forest actually declining to a point. And why I said it was originally abandoned starting in about the 1830s, forests started to return. Human population went up, and you notice around 1950, as the population is going up, the forest began to decline again. So that was sort of a turning point. At this time it's a slower loss than before because this is a loss to development. So today, these are our forests. If you look at both colors, the green and the blue, that's forest cover in the state. The green are the public lands, the state forests primarily. So we have some very big forests out there, but it really kind of pales when you look at the map this way because the blue is private land. And by far we have more private land than public land. And some of them are very small parcels. There are many, many small parcels. But private land is about 72% of our forest in the state. And we're the fourth most densely populated state. And it's believed that at about 55 to 57% forest cover, that there are few places in the country and even the world that actually have this much forest with this much population. We still have like 1.8 million acres of forest, 3.5 million people. That's not doing too bad with such a small state. Yes, sir, ma'am.
So if you had like water company land or land trust land, would that be counting in your green, or would that be the blue?
Yeah, that was actually going to be in the blue.
In the blue, okay.
Because like MVC, MVC is sort of an oddball. They're sort of a quasi-municipal. There's a couple of water companies that are municipal related. Many of them are actually private companies though out there.
Okay.
Yeah, that sort of depends on the water company you're talking about. But yeah, they're not on the public land. That's a good question. And I want to let you know that if you have any broad general questions, of course, I'd kind of like you to save it for the end. But if you have a relevant question, like to the slide we're talking about and stuff like that, feel free to raise your hand and just let me know. And we can cover it, okay? No big deal there. Now, climate change. Talk about shifting gears just a little bit for a moment. Climate change in Connecticut, it's happening. Forest management, forestry has typically been about traditional things like harvesting renewable forest products, improving wildlife habitat and stuff like that. But now climate change has kind of thrown an extra monkey wrench into things because it's both complicated and it's justified forestry more than ever. Most forests today are seen as a great natural mitigation for climate change in multiple ways. But at the same time, the impacts of climate change can reduce the vigor and the health of our forests. And if we don't have healthy forests, they're not going to be able to mitigate climate change as well. So it all goes around in circles. It's all interrelated. And that's kind of the primary thing I want to impress on you today, is that more than ever, we actually need to manage our forests, and we need to do so with climate change in mind. So in Connecticut, some interesting stats. Some of this is going to be more than you really need to know today, but temperatures in Connecticut have risen about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the turn of the 20th century. And this is about 1 degree higher than the global average during that same time. But we have the potential to increase another 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit before the year 2100. So it's accelerating. And what's interesting in Connecticut is the winter temperature is actually increasing more than the average throughout the year in the summer temperature. So what we're seeing is we're seeing milder winters, less snow cover, more rainfall. It's really changing a lot of things on the landscape in the long run, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly too. So, bad news is that climate change and land use conversion does compromise the ability of our forests to function as the mitigation. So, we have a longer growing season coming, disproportionate warming in the winter that I just mentioned. That there's increased soil respiration, and with that you have a more vulnerable situation for frost, and that impacts carbon storage capacity, and it impacts tree health. So it's all really related. Now, a lot of times when we talk about climate change and how forests relate to that, we talk about carbon. Just to get a little basic, carbon, first of all, what is it? Well, it's a non-metallic element from the periodic table. It's the building blocks of all life. If anyone here is a Star Trek fan, you know, if you saw the first Star Trek movie, where the V'ger robot is referring to all of us as carbon-based life forms. So that's true. We're all carbon-based life forms. Carbon forms more compounds than all of the other elements on the periodic table combined. The compound CO2, of course, is most responsible for climate change, probably more than any other individual element or compound. So the forest carbon cycle, there's what we call in the forest a carbon pool. Now the carbon pool is made up of how much carbon is stored and how much carbon is going to be changing in the future. So that's carbon storage, carbon sequestration. That's the process. And sequestration is kind of a long word. I will probably stumble over it before this is over. But it basically refers to the taking of carbon out of the atmosphere, which is what we really want, and then storing it in the tree in some cases. But that's a natural part of photosynthesis from any plant. So New England forest, just as an interesting fact, is actually a carbon sink. Now what that means is basically sequestration exceeds emissions in the state, in the region, wherever you're talking about. So northeastern forests are actually documented to sequester and store more carbon than they release, resulting in an offset of about 14% of our region's annual greenhouse gas emissions, which is a really cool fact. Well, 14% is 14%, but that's something. And at least it's trying to say that our forests are actually doing a pretty good job, and we want them to continue doing that. Now, stewardship. Stewardship is in the title of the program, so I probably should talk about what stewardship actually is. Stewardship, if you look up the definition, if you just Google it like kids do today on their phone, you can define it as the job of supervising or taking care of something. It's responsibility and care to nurture something for all of us in the future, is one way to put it. So, to achieve goals that require planning and work rather than inaction is something that's implied, right? So, why should your students really care? Well, because good stewardship, forestry, can be equated to stopping littering, for instance. Wanting cleaner oceans with our plastics out of our oceans. That's all stewardship. So it goes hand in hand with trying to do the same thing. Excuse me. Now, why manage? And I should mention, it's appropriate at this point, that for most practical purposes, management and stewardship are synonyms for the purpose of this talk today. I'm going to back up a little bit. Nope, not that back up, the other back up. In that picture right there, I have that in stewardship. It's kind of an interesting reason. I didn't tell you that when I was on the slide. But those are seedlings. On the left, you've got a tulip poplar. On the right, you've got northern red oak. What's interesting is these were established after a clear cut. Now, is clear cutting good forest stewardship? Sometimes it is, in the context of whatever your objectives might be. You might be trying to regenerate a native forest so that you have a balance of age classes in the landscape. So if you clear cut and you're responsibly nurturing a new generation of trees that are going to be grown there, then yes, of course it's good stewardship. These tree species are both shade intolerant. They do not like to grow in the shade of an overstory canopy. So they're not going to make it if you do otherwise. So they need a lot of full sunlight. So yes, that can be good stewardship. So we manage our forest for many reasons. This is really getting down to the basics, but it's kind of important to do a review of it. Healthier, more diverse forest environments for wildlife habitat. Maybe it's for the protection and enhancement of endangered or threatened species. Sometimes it's not just a matter of we want to stay away from an area if there's an endangered species there. Maybe we need to know what that species is and what its habitat requirements are. Maybe it actually requires some active management and some work on our part. So, a sustainable supply of renewable forest products. This is actually important. Now, we don't harvest trees on state land for the money, as we have been accused of doing by the public. This is a byproduct of work that we're trying to do on the ground. But it's very good that we have that byproduct and there's a demand for it, because we can get work done for the value of timber without having to pay to get it all done. And frankly, there is a demand for forest products. If you really knew the full scope of what forest products includes today, it's page after page of products that most of us know about or use every day. It's amazing. And all of those products, they're going to come from somewhere, because demand dictates that. If they don't come from local forest, if they're not locally sourced, maybe grown in forests that we want to manage with good stewardship principles, then they're going to come from a part of the world where maybe that isn't the case. Now, that we all live on one planet. It's one globe, last I checked. And so what happens in one area, if you're trying to do something for climate change, but you're just shifting that impact somewhere else in the world, does that really net anything good in the end for all of us? So I'm very much about locally grown forest products. More effective watershed protection, clean water, of course climate change mitigation, and greater resilience. And that's a whole topic in itself in just a few minutes. So forest management. Forest management itself is the application of scientific principles by usually a certified professional in order to meet specific goals. And it can take many forms. Many different kinds of practices can be included in forestry. So I want to bring up some key words there. Management of forests to promote health and resilience. Now, ultimately, we've often said in DEEP that our primary goal, if you could sum it up in one word, is diversity. Well, today it's more like two words. Diversity and resilience is what we're shooting for. And there's different ways to go about this. There's a whole portfolio of forestry options. Passive management, let's see if I can get that. Passive management right there, which means, some cases it means doing nothing at all except watching and letting nature take its course. Letting an area try to turn into a future old growth, for instance. There's a place for that. Reforestation and afforestation, that's just basically turning an area into forest that isn't at present. And then active management. So there's passive and there's active, and we're going to talk about that. Passive management. Passive management can mean a lot of things, but mostly it means not actively managing, right? But I'm going to try to go up and look at something here. Oh. One important thing about passive management to keep in mind is that doing so is an active decision. So choosing not to do something with an area shouldn't be an arbitrary thing that we just simply say we want to leave this 70,000 acres alone and not do a thing with it. There needs to be science and reason behind that. There need to be people in boots on the ground actually collecting data and justifying that. And that's an important point, because there is a lot of movement out there to try to not manage forest for the sake of climate change. But that's only when you're really talking about carbon storage. It's not necessarily maximizing forest health for carbon sequestration, and it's not necessarily providing the most healthy and diverse and resilient forest. And all of those components are important. It's not just about carbon storage. So we go from passive management to active management, and this is where, we actually do cutting, timber harvesting in some cases. Active management can be things like controlled burning, prescribed fire. It can be invasive plant control. Pretty much anything that you want to do on the landscape to change the condition out there. So, I'm not going to define all of this. These are just different kinds of cuttings, like we practice, for instance, on state land. Active management can also be climate smart. There is such a thing now as climate smart forestry. And basically we're taking principles like thinnings and selection cutting and stuff like we saw on the previous slide, and we're slightly modifying it with climate change in mind, just like we've often done with wildlife habitat in mind. I don't know if all of you have heard that the Audubon Society came up with a program called Foresters for the Birds. And it's how you can modify slightly forest practices that are pretty traditional and make the area even better for various kinds of birds. So it's sort of the same principle. Stuff like expanded gaps. Expanded gap was something I think that was started by Audubon. It's where you have a hole in the canopy. It may be artificially produced in forestry. It may be naturally produced. Say you had a downdraft or something came through and knocked a few trees down and created an opening in the canopy. Expanded gaps, you go in and you cut around that gap and just keep expanding that area and making it larger and more useful. So it is possible through forestry to do this. It has even been discovered by the New England Forestry Foundation in Massachusetts that you can have slightly modified uneven age management, selection cutting, and you can actually duplicate more rapidly old growth conditions in the forest. So if you want a forest that's old growth and you want to get it there, you can actually do so a little faster through management techniques. Now, this is a beautiful section of forest. It's in Tunxus State Forest in Heartland, one of my former areas for many years. It's a beautiful spot, some nice big healthy straight looking trees. I mean, what would you do here? Now, a lot of the public would look at this and go, oh my gosh, you leave it alone. It's beautiful as it is. Why do you want to do anything in there? Well, of course, a photo is just a snippet of what's actually out there. You don't see everything. You can't see the upper canopy. You can't see the crowns. Maybe there aren't any. Maybe this was an area where spongy moth, which is formerly gypsy moth, if anyone hasn't heard that yet, attacked the area and the trees are actually dead or dying. You can't see the ground. So it looks good, but a photo doesn't tell you the whole picture. And that's one of my points also when you're talking about large areas of reserves, that you don't want to arbitrarily just set areas aside without being on the ground and actually collecting data and seeing everything that there is to see out there. So a picture is the same way. Another thing is, not going to go off on a tangent too long, but just based on some other species in this slide, it's probably a very moist, rich growing site. The oak is probably not going to be back there. So when these oaks die, it's probably going to get replaced by birch, maple, and beech. And oak requires, once again, a lot of disturbance. We were just talking about earlier, So this oak is probably here because culture in history, the past, and the practices that were done there. If those oaks disappear, you're not going to get a new generation of oak coming back. And that's actually a statewide issue we have right now. It's predicted that in this century, we're going to lose a lot of our oak hickory forest naturally to the succession to birch and maple, and in some cases beech. And in some cases that's okay. Diversity is great, but anything the same statewide is not necessarily great. Oak is known to have a lot more wildlife values. They host more native insects. As a result, they host more migratory birds that feed on those insects, all the way up the food chain. So that is a dilemma that foresters face, is doing the kinds of intense management you really need to favor oak and hickory, although, once again, private landowners own 72% of the state's forest. How many private landowners do you go up to that are excited about the prospect of clear cutting their property? Probably not many. And I can't totally blame them, but at the same time, this is leading towards a future that's changing our forest types and forest condition. So, the justification for management. Many people don't realize that over 80% of our migratory bird species that require young forest habitat or farmland, open fields, are all in decline. This is not the case with birds that like forest interiors and older forests, but we are losing our young forest habitat species. I think on the left is prairie warbler, upper right is, help me out, let's see. Anyone here know their birds? Oh, towhee, right, it's an eastern towhee. Blue-winged warbler down on the bottom left, and then on the bottom right is common yellowthroat. I mean, all of these birds, if you really favor them, good size openings in the canopy, shelter woods, clear cuts, making big openings, big areas of early successional habitat that are going to become forest again, but meanwhile, they really benefit birds like these. Pitch pine. Now this is like talk about a species that is disturbance dependent. This is like disturbance squared. The best way to get pitch pine back is traditionally clear cutting, maybe leaving a few seed trees, scarifying the soil, even doing a controlled burn on the ground, and then they will get reestablished. Now this is the single most imperiled ecosystem and forest type we have in the state. Pitch pine is vanishing. But we do everything we can on state property to try to manage for it wherever possible. But this is just an example where you can't just get rid of active management. There's a real need for that. Clear cut. This was a clear cut that I actually did in Wyandotte State Forest in Warren. The justification for it was primarily for New England cottontail. The bunny on the right is not an eastern cottontail that most of us know of in our backyards. Those are actually invasive species that moved in here and took over the area. But our only native rabbit here in Connecticut is New England cottontail, and it's a federal concern. So we're out there creating habitat for these guys, and this one, by the way, has been a success. I was out there just yesterday. Not to look at rabbits, but I was just out there. Cerulean warbler. Now, if you've never heard of this bird, it's a special bird of international concern. It's an international indicator, as a matter of fact. It goes to the tropics, like many birds do, and overwinters there, but comes here specifically to nest. And they are actually on the rise now. They're not in decline. They're gradually on the rise in the state. And I have designed, as many of my colleagues are now doing, management specific to cerulean warbler. They like large crowned old sugar maples and white oaks and red oaks without the canopies touching, and they like large areas that are open in between so that they can nest in the tops of those trees, and they do a lot of foraging down below and the brushy growth that comes up. So we are actually managing with one specific bird in mind in some of our forests. Oops. Nope. Back, forward. This is an area where, I don't know if you can see the blue horizontal marks. This is marked for timber cutting. And this is going to be a selection cut, kind of modified a little bit with what I was telling you, cerulean warblers. You can see there's a tree here that's marked. There's one there that's marked. I believe there's another one in the background. Yes, they're big trees. There's also some big ones being left behind though. And what this is going to do is create canopy gaps, because you see there's not much in the ground right there growing now. But there will be when we make these canopy gaps. So you'll end up having a brushy understory. You'll have a lot of seedlings and saplings coming along. And all of a sudden, guess what? You've got brand new nesting habitat that wasn't there before. You've got more foraging opportunities down near the ground. So it's all about sunlight. That was uneven age management. So resilience. Now, if there's something else you don't forget from today, I hope it's this. That it's thundering. Forests are only effective in combating climate change if they're healthy and resilient. That's an important point. The one on the right is actually a more diverse condition. It's kind of like what I was just describing in that other picture where we marked the trees. You've got a lot of brushy growth in the understory. There's a you've got a diversity of ages and species coming along. Now on the left, that is all beech sprouts, the whole understory in this area. And what do we know about beech now, unfortunately? Anybody been following that in the media?
It's dying.
Yep.
The beech leaf disease?
Yes. Unfortunately, there's the new beech leaf disease that's only been known here for maybe 4 or 5 years. But it's swept through the countryside, and most of our beech are actually hurting or dying or dead, if not. So it's not a very diverse situation there. It's not a very healthy situation. So beech leaf disease is probably going to be here to stay, unfortunately. It's caused by a microscopic little worm, a nematode, which is very unusual for having a tree issue like that here, caused by a nematode, but it's happening. So a resilient forest is the capacity of a forest to respond to a disturbance by resisting damage or stress and recovering quickly. So that's pretty significant. And one way we do that is with diversity, not having all trees the same age. Just a quick story. Housatonic State Forest in Sharon, in that area in Cornwall, just got pounded by the spongy moth 2021 and 2022, much as eastern Connecticut did before that. This whole property, 10,000 acres at one point, was owned by an iron company. Why did they own it? So they could keep clear cutting it for charcoal production. So you have this nice uniformly aged oak forest that came up as a result of all that disturbance. And now you have this forest that's like 100 to 130 years old in most cases, that is strictly oak hickory. It's all around the same age class, not much diversity. We knew that was an issue. And then along comes this insect that defoliated and killed many of them. So it's important to break things up. Diversity of species and ages. And you have to do that with active management, of course. What's funny is Jeff Ward from the Agricultural Experiment Station did some research up there, and he found out that of the large saw timber sized trees, 70% plus died from the insect attack. For small trees, saplings, poles, small saw timber trees, less than 4% of them died. So youth is strong and healthy. Remember that. As we all get older, I'm there, I don't know about you, but I'm speaking for myself. As you get older, you get sometimes a little less resilient. Maybe you get a little less healthy. And it's the same with trees or any life form. So, in concluding this talk today, just what is a forester? Just for a little bit. This is information you can take back to kids, take back to your classes if you're a teacher, and actually try to get them to enter our profession. Because I have to tell you, there's actually more opportunities in forestry today, not less. As we go into the era of climate change, there's actually becoming more and more opportunities for employment. So keep that in mind. What does a forester do? Well, there's many things a forester can do, but one of the things that I would like to emphasize is if you're given a tract of forest land, manage it. What does that involve? So that's what this is. They tend to map and collect data on a forest. They analyze the forest condition from the data, and they identify changes that may be needed to achieve expressed goals. Now, in some cases, that may be passive management. Actually, both passive and active management have an important place in most woodlands and across the state in our forest on the landscape level. So they write management plans, then they prepare the area on the ground for any active management. And a lot of times that involves marking the trees. I have spent many days in the last several decades marking timber for timber harvest. So then they supervise the whole operation on the ground. Usually they supervise the logging or whatever the activity specifically may be. In some cases, it just may be invasive plant control, but that's important. So, and then they administer contracts and permitting, and just basically help ensure that everything goes well on the ground. That there's environmental mitigations involved, that the landowner is happy, and the landowner's achieving their objectives. So that's, in a nutshell, what many foresters do. Foresters at work, firefighting on the upper left. Sometimes that is just digging in the dirt and dirty, kind of unpleasant work, but it kind of depends on the assignment, what's going on. Over in the upper right, that's starting a fire on purpose. It's a controlled burn going up the slope there. This is Japanese barberry. As you can see, there's a nice bright green understory of solid Japanese barberry there. And there's actually two foresters you can barely see on this slide that are actually working on eradicating it. So that's what we call a long day. Now the middle slide, I talked about sometimes it's a matter of protecting endangered species or threatened species. Whatever that may be, it depends on the species. Do you see anything in there? In that slide besides a few green leaves? I see something if you look right in the middle. Now it may be the lighting in here or how far away you're sitting, but there's a timber rattler right there curled up. So we have timber rattlesnakes. They're a state endangered species. They only occur in a couple of rare places in the state. Housatonic State Forest is one of them up in Sharon. And so we're restricted at certain times of the year that we're not supposed to do any active forestry on the ground that involves equipment and stuff like that when they're actually out there active. It has to be when they're dormant in the wintertime. But we're also finding that in past research has shown that the gravid females, pregnant females, love to hang out in clear cuts where it's full sunlight, where they can warm up and then they can crawl under cover like logging slash when they get too warm. So we're doing habitat work out there for them. We're trying to protect individuals, and we're also doing habitat work to improve their diversity of habitat out there. So there's many different kinds of foresters these days. If anyone's interested in employment opportunities, they're not all the same. You can be in the public sector like me and either work with private landowner assistance or manage public land. You can work in the private sector as a private consulting forester representing landowner interests. You can be a procurement forester, a timber buyer. So basically, you're representing your employer instead of the landowner. You're going out trying to buy standing timber on woodlots, maybe to feed a mill, who might be your employer. Watershed, our water companies generally have foresters that manage their land. You can be into research. You can teach. There's even a whole category of urban forestry that's really growing these days. And then carbon and climate change. There's such a thing as actually selling carbon credits on your property these days, well, where you're basically getting paid to leave your carbon stored in place. And there's actually private foresters out there who are tasked with going out and literally wherever these properties occur across the country, and I know someone who does this, they inspect the property for compliance for their contract regarding carbon storage. So it's a whole up and coming category of work. So what I would say to any kid that you talk to that might be interested in any kind of natural resource management is, number one, computer skills. Especially GIS skills are critical now. And the other one is just plain communications. You've got to be really good at both verbal and written communications. You need to be able to get your message out there, so to speak. Many of us, especially the ones that are taxpayer funded one way or the other, really depend on the public support for the kinds of work we do and the importance of what we do and believe in. But if you can't get your message out there like this and explain it and explain why we do what we do, it's becoming a little bit more of a challenge. And in the long run, we may not actually make it. So it's all about communications. And so in conclusion, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. This is me on a hike a few years ago with my kids. Just to give you an update, the little girl right there graduates from high school next month. And that little boy there is actually here today in the Envirothon competition. So he would actually hate that I have this slide up here.
Only my class.
Right there, yep. So this is my contact information. If you can't see it, you're welcome to. What I do plan to do is also leave some outdated, unfortunately, business cards and handouts up here that you're welcome and encouraged to come get. Just please remember that if you get a business card, just pay attention to my cell phone and my email address. All right, that's it. But at least with that, you know how to get in touch with me if you have any questions that come up later on. And I'm planning to get more involved in Envirothon as time goes on. And you may see me for more follow-ups like this to this introductory talk over the coming year. So we'll see what pans out with that. But I'd be more than happy to do that. And I am based in the Marlboro Eastern District Headquarters office. But thank you, and I want to see if there's any questions that you've just been chomping at the bit for. Yes?
Can I ask a specific one?
You can ask anything you want.
So you mentioned GIS skills are important for students looking to get into like the industry. What about GIS, because it's kind of a really broad field? Like, what should they be skilled in?
Well, you know, that partly depends on who your employer is going to ultimately end up being, and it also depends on where we go with technology in the next few years. It changes so quickly. I mean, we're using ArcMap, trying to get onto ArcGIS Pro now. That's a big one, I know, for employers. There are other platforms out there and stuff. I would say ArcGIS is a good start.
Building maps or being able to read?
Yes. Oh, yeah. All of the above, but mostly mapping. Any mapping that you do, building maps, creating maps, understanding them, and understanding how to navigate your way through these programs is really important. And a lot of good forestry schools and natural resource schools out there, they're teaching this. I mean, they understand very well how critical it is. So they'll probably get a background in it. But I'm of the disadvantage where it's not second nature to me. And so I'm too young to retire, and I'm too old to understand any of it. So here I am stuck in the middle trying to struggle through it, but it's a generational thing. Yes?
When you do some of those canopy cuts or clear cutting, do you have a lot of problems with invasive species moving in, or does it depend on the area?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's always a concern. in many of those areas, like the one you saw in the picture where the trees were marked, I mean, we really don't have invasives out there, and therefore we don't expect them to be there, but we always have follow-up monitoring for any of these sites. And if they do start to show up, we take care of them, especially wherever we manage. Because the last thing we want is to be accused of causing the spread of invasives just from our work. So we have a strong focus. You're not really getting rid of invasives across the whole landscape, but we focus on wherever we're managing. We don't want it to inhibit our objectives. So, does that make sense?
Yep.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Is there an ideal ratio of like old growth forests and new growth forests to like maximize biodiversity in the area? Like, is there like an approaching number for that, or is that just?
Well, I mean, is it about time?
No, repeat the question so everyone can hear.
Oh, okay. So, gentleman here asked, is there any real difference in like old growth forest versus newer growth? By was it by percentage?
Yeah, like what? Like, is there an ideal ratio of like in an area like older to newer?
Oh, ideal ratio. Andrew, you have a good answer for that one?
Well, I trust your ability to answer this question, but I just want to first say that you cannot create old growth forests. They are defined by land use history. So in the state of Connecticut, though it's not a statutory definition, we, the division, define old growth forests as those that did not experience the intensive human impacts of colonization. So Connecticut doesn't have any. However, we can, through both passive management and active management, foster old growth characteristics on our landscape. So to answer your question, no, there's not a specific ratio of old growth characteristics to early successional habitat characteristics that we're trying to achieve. But on the landscape level, we have a gross underrepresentation of early successional habitat. So there is more of an emphasis on fostering those characteristics through management because, as David mentioned, most of our forest land is privately owned, and most private landowners are not actively managing their forests, and as a result, we're not seeing those characteristics develop naturally as quickly as we would like for the benefit of wildlife and biodiversity. So it's all important, and we want all, both old growth characteristics, early successional habitat, and everything in between represented. And there's right now more of an emphasis on early successional because it's so disproportionate. Is that helpful?
And if I could add to that from a wildlife perspective, from a wildlife perspective, in general, we say on our wildlife areas, 20% young forest, but each area is going to be different. So you really have to look at each area, what you have there, what you could potentially have there. But as Dave mentioned, when you open up that canopy and start to grow, it might sound counterintuitive. What, we're cutting down forests to help wildlife? So you might think a wildlife biologist would be telling the foresters, oh no, don't cut down those trees, but actually we're telling them, oh please, can you cut down more trees? Because like Andrea said, we are lacking that early stage habitat that many of our rarer species depend on. So if you look at our list of threatened and endangered wildlife, many of the species on that list are the ones that depend on that early stage habitat that we create by cutting down trees and letting the new forest grow.
And a good point too is that, we don't have actual authentic old growth, but we do have mostly older forest out there. And I've been quoting that the average age of our forests are probably between 100 and 120 across much of the state. In some cases, it's a little more like 80 to 100. But it's around that century or more mark. And that's pretty much what we have across most of the landscape. Do you have a statistic for how much is actually young forest out there, the early successional?
We might have an estimate, I don't have it on the top.
Okay, it's less than 5%, isn't it?
I know at one point when they were doing an analysis, it was about 5%. Yeah, so it was really low. right. And
Okay.
it's, 5% of the forest cover, yeah. And it's also estimated, so young forest is one kind of habitat. So if you're managing a forest, you have young forests, new trees growing, and then they grow more and more. But there's also grassland habitat as well. And it's estimated that we have less grassland habitat now than we did before the settlers arrived. And so many of our grassland species are just disappearing.
That's interesting. I didn't know that one, but I think there was a question towards the back, though, at one point. Is there still a question?
Oh, yeah, Lori had a question.
I was just going to say, like, even though you have like a more mature forest, there are birds like the cerulean warbler and other birds that depend upon these forest gaps or early successional habitat to get enough insects to feed their young. Is that correct?
Yeah, so, well, that's a good point. So we need to have those native plants to feed the insects because nearly all of our terrestrial birds raise their young on insects. Even the birds you see at your seed feeder are raising their young on insects. And as far as the cerulean warbler goes, you might consider that an old growth species because they need large trees. So they build their nest out on a branch of a large sugar maple or white oak, but there has to be understory. So the way that we can create habitat, like Andrea said, we can create old growth characteristics. We can go in and we can cut down the trees around those sugar maples and those white oaks to let those trees spread wide. So and another point for the carbon too, so some people are saying, well, we should leave the forest alone because older forests take out more carbon, but they don't. An older tree that has plenty of room to grow will take out more carbon, but this is not what our forests look like now. This is what our forests look like now. So our younger forests actually take out more carbon than our older forests. So if we were to just leave the forest to become old growth, how long would that take before our forest had trees that could spread out like this and had all this understory? Well, it would be a lot longer than the cerulean warblers can wait because the cerulean warblers don't wait that long. But we can create habitat for them by releasing those sugar maples and those white oaks, letting the understory grow up underneath, and promoting grapevines. Because it's been found that their successful nests are ones that are associated with grapevines. So, and again, this is where...
Is it because the grapevines
They,
promote insects?
well, the grapevines will be feeding, so there's some caterpillars that are specific to grapevines. And also, they think that it might have something to do with the grapevines concealing the nest. But they have found that the nests are more successful if they're associated with the grapevines. So, if your goal is to grow a bunch of oaks, you might not like grapevines. I know some foresters are not happy with grapevines. But if you grow cerulean warblers, then you want to promote the grapevines.
Interesting. Yeah. All right, so remember that. Cut bittersweet, not grapevines. All right, so any more questions? I'm not sure where we are on the time at this point. If anyone can update me on that.
9:26.
No, okay. So that's about right. But I will be here just a little bit longer. I am going to pull out a few handouts that I plan to put right here, if that's okay with you guys, including the business cards I was talking about. All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.